During a much-anticipated meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Argentina, China and the U.S. have called a truce on the escalation of trade tensions between the world's two largest economies. President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump agreed to step back and restart negotiations in hope that coordination, cooperation and stability can be re-established in China-U.S. relations. And in a key concession, President Donald Trump agreed to pause the addition of further trade tariffs scheduled for January. In addition, the G20 summit has ended up with a joint declaration reached on building consensus for fair and sustainable development. So what happens next between the U.S. and China? What has been agreed so far, and what are the prospects for China-U.S. relations in the near future? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Cheng Dawei from the School of Economics at Renmin University of China and Professor Jeffrey Towson from the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pan Deng. Dear guests, this is a crucial meeting indeed. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said President Xi Jinping and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump reached an important consensus during their working dinner in Buenos Aires. Professor Cheng, what's your take on this important consensus?
I think it's a very important meeting because it stopped the war at that time. You know, after more than half years, we don't know which direction President Trump wants lead the war. So now he has a clear message. Okay, we can sit down, we can talk.
So now you get a clear idea on the direction President Donald Trump would take?
I think at least in the statement he make two things impress me. One is he said we found something good for the U.S., something good for China. Let's kind of Chinese saying win-win situation, win-win solution. And another one is he says what we can do within 90 days. This kind of framework has been set up.
What's your take on this, Professor Towson?
And I think the pertinent upcoming thing was the January 1st date, right? That was the date when this could escalate. Okay, that's been delayed. So there's no big escalation coming this month. That's very good. I think maybe the process is as important as the outcome. There's not one simple issue here. There's quite a lot of issues. They're pretty complicated. So the process of the U.S. and China learning to sort of deal with each other in areas where they maybe disagree, don't agree, that process I thought was actually pretty important, that we had the two presidents sitting down and starting to talk through this and maybe learn to work with each other. Because this is there's a lot on the table. I mean, the process may be as important as any short-term outcome.
So since we're talking about upcoming negotiations, and according to Xinhua reports, Beijing is committed to deepening reform and furthering opening up, and in the process, some economic and trade issues that are of Washington's concern will be solved, and meanwhile, the U.S. side will actively address China's concerns on economic and trade issues. Professor Cheng, do you think this is some kind of basic tone set here?
Yeah, the basic tone is we are going to talk, and already in the past the U.S. asked for actually 53 issues they raised to China, and China replied in the detail, and China replied in 143 terms, which is very in detail, and China divided all the issues in three kinds. The first kind is acceptable, which means we can negotiate, one can do right now, and then is unacceptable, which means maybe we insist on something. The third type is something we can negotiate, and I think that maybe means the structural issue, which means how to reform, how to improve IPR regime, and how to which means policy issue. So it's a complicated package, and we still don't know, how much we can achieve in the future.
So you've already mentioned international property rights protection, and what about high tech? Could these two be the sticking points in the upcoming negotiations between the two sides?
I think it's one of the priority subjects.
Why is it so difficult? Because China has been promising and has been doing deeds to protect the IPR in the country.
Yes, this is a long issue, old issue actually. When China, as China WTO accession period in 1990s is the issue raised by the U.S. government. They also used the 301, Section 301 against China, and they pushed China to build a IPR law. So we know, it's the right way to protect IPR. But now the issue facing us is, I think I can call the second generation IPR, intellectual property issue. Maybe we are both facing the future competition, such as digital trade, the industrial 4.0. So which means the whole competition landscape will be changed. So the many new IP issues will come, such like data localization, sometimes very crucial issue. So we are going to face maybe.
What about the high-tech issue here? Because many Chinese observers are believing that this could be a U.S. approach to curb China's further development in achieving high technology and cutting-edge technologies. Do you think that's the case?
I think the case, yeah. In the past.
So how can the two sides talk about this? Because China will develop.
I think we can just improve this part. We can improve our IPR system. That's no problem. But for some like what I just talking, digital trade. There's no international law here, and China and the U.S. can just go back to the multilateral system to resolve the issue and to push the IP protection in international level. Yeah.
What's your take on these two issues, Professor Telston?
I think what's interesting is, even though this is discussed in terms of trade and tariffs, I mean, it's clearly much bigger than this. It's clearly economic across the board, and it's sometimes sort of spilling out into this idea of, well, therefore tariffs. President Trump has said this, we're going to do tariffs based on IP. So, I mean, it is a broader dispute. So that's interesting, and within that I think the two pillars that most people point at are, yes, the trade issue is one. IP has got to be on that short list of 2 or 3 major issues for the U.S. and China going forward. And the trade one is a lot sort of easier to get your brain around, and you can kind of figure out what to do about it. IP is pretty complicated. You quickly go from IP protection into tech transfer. And the White House has put out statements in the past that this includes state subsidies. Well, that's more like economic development. Suddenly you're in a whole nother area. So that sector seems to bleed into a lot of aspects of almost policy. So that one I think is the one, like, in 90 days, I don't know about the IP issue. I mean, that's a pretty difficult subject. And it may be the one we deal with the rest of our lives, because
well, interestingly, you just mentioned that the trade part is easy, but is it really? Because the two countries' economic teams have to work out a plan to reduce or maybe eventually get rid of the existing tariffs on each other, and the amount is huge. Are you optimistic about that?
But at least you can see the number. We know what the export-import numbers are. We can measure it. How do you measure IP progress? In either direction. I mean, it's hard to even put a number on what that is. Okay, at least the trade, you have an outcome you can look at. You can look at goods on ships, and you can do those sorts of things. Is there an easy solution to a $375+ billion trade deficit? No, that's a huge number.
So what's your take on this?
I just short comment on you. I think, yes, within 90 days it's difficult to resolve.
But let's bear in mind that this 90 days is solely from the White House statement. The Chinese side didn't mention a specific time limit for future negotiations.
Oh, I think, Chinese have their, maybe, I don't know, the Chinese government maybe has their own step to, how to open our market, how to do our reform. So we have to, continue our policy.
So, but would you say that time is of essence here in future negotiations?
Yes. Yeah.
Why? Do you sense a kind of urgency?
It's urgency. I think, but some challenge, like we mentioned, it's difficult to, deal the IP within 90 days. So I still hope the U.S. government can give a lot of room for Chinese side to, finish the job. Yeah.
And Professor Towson, do you think President Donald Trump is under domestic pressure to decide on this pause on further tariffs on Chinese goods?
I mean, he's under pressure, generally speaking, right? It's a tough job. It doesn't seem to be playing out, like if you ask a typical American voter, which is what the president is concerned about, and all the political parties, this isn't an issue for them. It's something they may watch on TV, but it's not necessarily something they vote on. If you test their top 10 issues they vote on, this isn't probably one of them. So there's not that sort of pressure. It could be in certain Midwestern states. This could become an issue which were critical to him for election. But as long as the economy is humming along...
Looking at the performance of U.S. stock markets recently, would you say it's totally irrelevant to trade between China and maybe U.S. trade tensions with nearly all its neighbors and major allies?
It could be. It could be. But if you look at the economy underneath the stock market, I mean, it's not just doing well, it's doing spectacularly well. I mean, 3, maybe 4% growth.
Would you say that's the case for manufacturing industry, because GM just closed 3 major plants in the United States and keeps its plants in Mexico and China?
Right.
And
I think this is
President
why, like I just gave you like a national story, but then when you drill down to say the Midwest or Michigan, you're talking about auto. That could be a different picture, and politically it's a different picture. GM has announced some big layoffs. The president responded on Twitter, which is his habit. Fairly strong language, which is also his habit. And yeah, they're doing major workforce reductions. Major. I think 15%, something in that range. So you're talking about tens of thousands of people. Yeah, that's an issue, especially in districts that are very important to him electorally. So yeah, I mean, what causes what? Yeah, that could be an issue.
And earlier, President Trump also said that trade wars are easy to win. Do you think that's the case at the moment, or at least that's the case with China?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very famous, maybe the most famous quote about Donald Trump was a reporter or a blogger said, during the election, the press takes him literally but not seriously, but his supporters take him seriously but not literally. This might be one of the was that a literal statement of trade wars can be won easily or not? And the media will respond to it literally because that's their job, right? You have to take people at their word. His supporters very likely brush that off. So that's one of these question mark statements. I don't think people quite know what to make of it.
And on the contrary, China has been saying that there will be no winners in a trade war or any kind of war under the current world order. So how much effect the trade tensions have caused on the U.S. economy and the Chinese economy so far, Professor?
China economy is impacted a lot already. Last month in November, the PMI is decreasing, so which shows the factory order is decreasing. So we are facing some problem. Small businesses is out of business, SMEs, and also larger companies face difficulties in terms of if tariff goes further, maybe the import sector, the intermediate goods will increase, the price will increase. So I think they probably face more difficulties next year. So that's why we have to stop the trade war. So also, but I think...
What about the impact on the U.S. economy?
I think I a little bit do not agree with you. I think also impact the U.S. economy. If we use the further tariff, maybe all the consumers will buy, will pay for the tariff. So also
tariff is actually a tax on American people too, right?
Yeah, it's direct tax to American people. So also the international investment is decreasing. Now the world internet FDI decreased somehow 40% already. So you can see as the leader of the global society, the American president should think all the global picture, how the developing countries, how to survive. That's the Argentina statement said, we have to conserve the South-South cooperation. We have to care about the issue of development. So if you look at the future, we have to go back to the table to talk.
And Professor, earlier you talked about the governing style of President Donald Trump a little bit. So do you think there will be uncertainties from the Trump administration in the future talks between U.S. and China on trade?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've already seen this year. This has been going on for a good year now. And half the time people are asking this question of, what does he mean by that? Or what's he going to do next? Which is kind of the national sport we play in the United States, is what's he going to do next? Yeah, it creates a lot of uncertainty, and that might be a negotiating tactic, that might be a style. There might actually be some strength in operating that way as a negotiator in deals. But for the business world, that creates a lot of uncertainty. That's actually a problem. It's hard to make a big investment in a factory when you don't know what's going to happen. So this sort of style is problematic in the business world. Although it might well work well in deals he's done through his career. I suspect it has.
And China must rely on its own deeds for its own reform and opening up. And the country's leadership has been avowing this for a long time, even before the China-U.S. trade war kicked in, and China has held, talking about trade, China has been a strong supporter of multilateral trading system, and also China held its first ever international import expo in November, which is the very first such event on a national level in the world. What will China's efforts bring, what kind of opportunities will China's efforts bring to global businesses, not only the U.S.?
Yeah, China always, support the multilateral system. From the year we joined the WTO in year 2001 up to now. So it's, it's kind of, for me, it's kind of feel, a little bit weird. Why the system was built by the U.S. government, and then you are now trying to do things bilaterally, it's kind of weird. So also but I think China also has a big change. In the past, we just want to promote export a lot. And now we think, also import is so important. If we import, for example, in this deal, we may import a lot of agricultural product from the U.S. So which means the Chinese consumers can buy a little bit cheaper beef or cheaper, agricultural food.
So I'm very sure that those agricultural products will be a beef or...
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know the list, but I know at least some news agencies said agricultural product. Yeah, but the beef, the soybean was on the retaliation list before. So I think China will remove the retaliation somehow. Maybe
indeed, China has been changing its economy from an export-driven one to
more balanced trade.
And also a domestic consumption-driven one. You just came back from Shanghai, Professor Towson. What's the vibe you've been getting there for China's consumption potential?
Well, within all of this, certain things go up and down with the world trade. Certain things I would call more real. One real thing I study a lot is just Chinese consumers. They're buying a lot. They have money. They enjoy spending. Singles Day racked up $30 billion worth of sales in 24 hours. So within all of these questions and uncertainties, the Chinese consumers as an economic force are very real, and they have arrived, and they're growing very, very quickly. 25% of the world's growth in private consumption in the last 5-10 years, that's China. 25% is the U.S., which is an interesting comparison. So that's real. The exports could go up and down. Now, on the flip side, I would also say that American consumers are the real thing. That's a major economic phenomenon. So those two things are sort of what's at the base of a lot of this.
This also brings us to the structural problem within China-U.S. trade, because U.S. imports a huge amount of Chinese goods, while China imports huge amount of U.S. services. Do you think this kind of imbalance will also be addressed during this time's negotiation, Professor Towson?
Well, I mean, the numbers are pretty different. I mean, if you're in goods, you're talking $500 billion into the U.S. roughly. If you're talking services into China, I believe you're at 51 or 52 billion. So, I mean, these orders of magnitude different. That doesn't mean they're not important in many ways.
But at least the U.S. is having a surplus to China in service trade.
Right. There's a surplus on the 50 billion, which is actually, I would say, it's more important than just the dollar amount, because a lot of business is built through services, a lot of relationships, a lot of IT, a lot of things that are more important than the dollar value would imply happen within services in a way they don't happen with moving soybeans. So yeah, that 50 billion is a big deal, and the deficit is the other direction. With you know, China could rightfully complain against a service deficit and have a good point.
What's your take on this?
I agree. I totally agree.
That's not good. We'll try and argue more.
Right, so let's take a bigger picture of Sino-U.S. relations. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi said the two presidents agreed to keep in close touch with each other through visits, meetings, phone calls, and correspondence to continue providing guidance for the bilateral ties. And Xi and Trump agreed to have further exchange of visits at an appropriate time. Have you sensed any change of paradigm of diplomacy between China and the United States since direct exchanges or communications between heads of states are catching up, Professor?
I think, you know, sometimes President Trump is unbelievable. I don't know, you know, what which word he's saying is true or not. But I think when the two big countries' president announced to the world they are going to sit down and they are going to talk and build a top-level, you know, dialogue. That's so important. So I think it's so important to have a regular channel to talk, like phone calls, and to keep this channel, you know, smoothly. I think, yeah.
What's your take on this, Professor?
Yeah, I mean, underneath this, there's not a problem, but there's an ongoing situation that the U.S. and China are both ridiculously successful, but in very different ways and with very different systems. And how they're going to learn to work together over the next 50, 100 years has a lot, at least at the government level, has a lot to do with, you know, the president's teams meeting and talking. And I think that's a lot of what's going on this year, is two very different systems are figuring out how to sort of deal with each other, because neither's going away. So
you have to find a way to coexist.
Or to work out you are going to naturally have issues. You must.
Yes.
And it's going to be an ongoing list. At every month, every year it'll be different. How do you address them? How do you move them forward? And okay, we've taken care of this. How do we deal? You know, that process. I think that's what we're kind of seeing this year, is a putting that in place. And this last weekend looked quite good in that respect. The fact that both presidents met with their teams, and, you know, better than, say, messages being sent, which happened a lot earlier this year. So at that process, you know, it's going to be a big deal for a long time.
Right, since we've been talking about trade, let's take the bigger picture and take a closer look at what G20 leaders came up with. And in the leaders' declaration, I'll refer you to the exact wording here, Professor. The leader said, we also note current trade issues, and we reaffirm our pledge to use all policy tools to achieve strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth and safeguard against the downside risks by stepping up our dialogue and actions to enhance confidence. Very mild wording here, I would say, and one key word is missing, that is protectionism. Do you think the United States asked for it?
No. I think, you know, before the U.S. delegation, you know, on the way to Argentina, they discussed it. They were talking about what kind of trade language they are going to accept. Now they are using fair trade, not free trade. They are we are supporting multilateral system. We are supporting most of the favored nation treatment. Now they are conceding to change the word language. Yeah, but at least the final statement said, okay, we are going to fight protectionism. That's good signal for all the members. I think including President Trump, he signed, you know, agreement. Yeah.
So do you think this somehow reflects a kind of internal division within the Group 20? And some observers are even saying that it could be 19+1 on trade.
What I thought was very interesting about this statement is a month ago was the APEC meeting, and President Xi gave a
declaration.
Yeah, gave a very important speech. President Trump wasn't there. A lot of the language is very, very similar. Inclusive, that word was used in his speech. Sustainable, rules-based global governance.
Fairness.
Those, I mean, there was a lot of the same. That speech, in my impression, was a lot about against protectionism and unilateralism and more towards this multilateral. A lot of that language strikes me as very similar. So yeah, I think there's definitely a divide. Well, I wouldn't call it a divide, but there's definitely a difference. Is it 19-1? Maybe. Maybe not on everything, but I bet I could point to certain key points where it probably is 19-1 on a couple of those things, and then others maybe not.
Maybe climate change is one of those.
Yeah,
That seems to be one, right?
Also, the bad news from the statement is the President Trump also still insists on withdrawal from Paris. Paris
climate agreement.
Paris agreement. Yeah.
Right. So let's go back to multilateral trading a little bit, and I think every G20 member would agree that reforms are needed for the current WTO mechanism, and exact wording is, we therefore support the necessary reform of the WTO to improve its functioning. We will review progress at our next summit. Is this kind of action plan, or is it a plan to talk about it next year?
Actually, it's an action plan. A little bit looks like an action plan.
So you think it's a good thing that
it's a good thing. You compare the other paragraph of the of the statement. The other part, like climate change, they didn't push so much. There's no action plan. Like the U.S.-China trade talks, we set up a 90 days plan. But this talk about we are going to review the process. So I think that's the the main focus of the EU, China, and Canada, and the major members. That's why they push to have a real action.
Earlier you were saying that the United States is not happy with the current WTO mechanism, and they think China is taking advantage of the developing nation treatment. Do you think that's a fair judgment?
It's not. It's fair. China just actually benefited from the world trading system, but the U.S. also benefited from the system. So that's why I don't know which direction they are going to go if they don't use the WTO as an international system. What's the alternative? I don't know.
So you don't see any alternative on the table right now, even with those multilateral and regional trade agreements are coming up. For example, the negotiations on the RCEP and a new version of TPP led by Japan.
Yeah, that's kind of misdirection. We call the spaghetti bowl. It's like a lot of noodles inside,
Right.
Yeah, but
the world needs an umbrella arrangement to cover global multilateral trade.
That's called the rule system, rule-based system.
Right. What's your take on this, very quickly, Professor Towson?
I mean, there is this global system that's evolving, but it's hard to. Every time this has been discussed this year, APAC now, it does seem that U.S.-China sort of bubbles above the whole thing and overshadows it. Because when these two parties have an issue, it seems to weigh on everything. So it is a a spaghetti bowl that I don't want to use the analogy of two big meatballs, but there's definitely the U.S.-China situation is sort of overshadowing everything. I think at least this year.
Right. Thank you very much, guests, for your input, and that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Han Deng in Beijing. Bye bye.